Hey guys, it's me, Sam Stein, managing editor at the Bulwark. I'm here with Ryan Goodman, our friend from Just Security. We are going to be talking about a Supreme Court decision that dropped tonight being Monday, April 7th, right before the big basketball game. Thanks, SCOTUS. Before we get to that, Ryan, thank you for joining us, and thank you guys for watching us. Subscribe to our feed. We really appreciate it. All right, so Ryan, this case had to deal with the use of the Aliens Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan migrants who were being detained. Highly controversial because what happened was a couple weeks ago, with almost no warning, in fact, maybe some subterfuge, the administration put about 300 migrants on a plane, brought them to El Salvador, and then kind of messed around with the judge, and we're not being very forthcoming about the circumstances, and they may have, in fact, violated the judge's decree that they don't do it. Subsequently, it's turned out that in all likelihood, a couple of these migrants, at least, were wrongfully sent there. We know, in fact, one was definitely wrongfully sent there because the government admitted it. The Supreme Court didn't rule on that specific case, but they did rule on a narrow issue of the Aliens Enemies Act. Give us the 30,000-foot ruling summary, and then I'm going to pepper you with some questions.
Sure. So the 30,000-foot summary is one, the Supreme Court extinguished the district court judge's order by saying essentially this is the wrong place to bring the lawsuit. They should have brought it as a habeas petition, meaning for somebody who's being held in custody, where that person is held in custody in that location, which just so happens to be Texas.
A little more hostile.
A little hostile, and a little bit of an explanation as to why the government brought all of these people from different parts of the country to Texas to then fly them out, because that would be a very hospitable jurisdiction for the government, the most conservative jurisdiction of any of the jurisdictions that are out there. So the Supreme Court just basically said the district court was wrong. This should have initially been brought in Texas. The only other piece that I would mention at the 30,000-foot level that's super important for people not to lose sight of is that the Supreme Court does give a back of the hand to one of the government's main arguments. In the D.C. Court of Appeals oral argument, lo and behold, the Department of Justice lawyers said, yes, people have habeas rights. They also wanted it in Texas, but we need to give them no notice and no time to pursue their habeas petition. We could just fly them out of the country without even warning them in advance. And the Supreme Court today says, no, they get due process, and that includes notice and a full opportunity to realize their habeas rights.
Right, and that seems, I know the headlines are that the administration won this case. And in fact, there's a lot of crowing. We have Stephen Miller out there. We're going to show the tweet saying, we can go ahead and do everything we wanted to do. We can use the Alien Enemies Act now and deport all these people. The reality, as I read it, and I am not a lawyer, but the reality is far different in my vantage point, which is they do actually have to give a warning to people that they are being targeted for the under the Alien Enemies Act, and those people in turn would get a right for habeas petition. Now, yes, in a hostile venue, and I want to get into the distinction between habeas petition and the Administrative Procedure Act petition, but to me, this doesn't necessarily ring like a Trump administration victory.
That's right. Totally agree with everything you said. That in all likelihood, we're now going to see the new litigation taking place, admittedly, in Texas. But then any of these cases are in some sense going to be brought up to the Supreme Court, which will finally have the decision. Yeah. So whatever Texas decides and the Fifth Circuit decides.
I guess the other question is what, and this is important, is what did the Supreme Court not render a decision on? Because there are big questions that still are unanswered.
Absolutely. In fact, the Supreme Court basically said, look, when these habeas cases come up, then we will render opinions on a bunch of questions, and that in habeas, people can bring up claims about the constitutionality of the Alien Enemies Act, the statutory interpretation of the Alien Enemies Act, and whether or not somebody is properly identified as a Venezuelan TDA member. Yeah,
that's the big one. Is how are they identifying Venezuelans as Tren de Aragua members? And also secondarily is, and maybe I'm overinterpreting this, but how does the government make the distinction that we are in an act of war and Tren de Aragua is a foreign entity invading America, which it seems like is the prerequisite for using the AEA?
Yeah. They're doing that in the most outlandish way. That as far as I'm concerned, as long as the Supreme Court says that that is justiciable, that they can actually look under the hood and scrutinize the government's basis for making that claim, the government will lose. And that government basically lost that at the D.C. Court of Appeals, including by a conservative judge on the
So
panel.
the government says we don't even want to argue it. You just have to take our word for it. But that's still in play.
That's absolutely in play, it seems, especially because the Supreme Court today kind of signaled it as well. And so I think that's going to be litigated. And I'll throw out one other curveball.
Sure.
So I do think this is everything that we've described in terms of people who are currently being detained and could be deported. What about the 200 plus people, up to 300 people in El Salvador? They too should be able to get habeas claims, because including the fact that today the U.S. Supreme Court just said they were denied due process rights because they weren't given notice and opportunity, et cetera. If anything, if you read the notice that the government gave some of them got no notice at all. It actually says you are not entitled to judicial review. Okay. So it told them the opposite.
Right.
So here's the interesting piece. If they bring habeas, where would they bring it? There's a very good argument that if you're going to bring extraterritorial habeas, you bring it in D.C. So it might all be going back to Judge Boasberg for those people that have already been taken out of the country. And we'll see how that plays out.
Well, then the administration would appeal that and say, no, you have to do it in Texas, and we'll end up in the exact same spot.
Potentially so, yeah.
Okay. Jesus. Without like, I don't know if it's possible to do this, but without getting too much in the weeds, what is the actual distinction between a habeas petition and the Administrative Procedure Act? What kind of restraints do these detainees or these migrants have by not going through the APA?
I think interestingly, the biggest constraint is the jurisdiction in which they'd have to bring the claim.
Okay. So if it was under the APA, you maybe could say, no, we're going to bring it in DC, but now with habeas, it's where you're confined.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Talk about the dissents a little bit, because I know you were reading through those.
Yeah. So interestingly, Justice Barrett joins the dissent, so it's a 5-4 decision. She joins parts of the dissent. Mm. And to me, one of the most interesting parts that she decides to join is like a 2-paragraph part. It's part 2. And what does part 2 say? But Justice Sotomayor, who's writing the dissent, says, it is important to note that all 9 justices today agree that these individuals get due process rights, notice, opportunity to be heard, etc. And it's funny because some people are also pointing out Stephen Miller's prior X tweets in which he said these people get no due process, which is the Supreme Court saying that's not true, totally unconstitutional. Yeah, so I think that's an important part. And then she also spells out the other legal questions that could also arise in habeas that we just discussed. Now, even though Justice Barrett does join that, there's a part of me that I think some members of the 5 majority, Alito, Thomas, would say, we didn't agree with that.
Right.
We didn't agree. Yeah.
Sotomayor in her dissent, she had this kind of harrowing point about, and I'm not sure if this is how you read it, but she said, this decision does give the administration the green light to just kind of keep disappearing people. Now, I don't know if I read it the same way, because they would have to get a notification that they are under the Alien Enemies Act jurisdiction. But maybe I'm misreading it. I'm curious if you read her dissent at all.
Yeah, no, I did. I do think that I don't read it that way. I read that there's a narrowing way you can read the Supreme Court, and I think that's the proper way to read what the Supreme Court's saying. I do think she's right about a lot of the optics of what the Supreme Court just did, because they are in some ways giving not a green light, but they are encouraging the Trump administration to have gotten away with what looks like contempt of court, et cetera. And one other piece that we haven't discussed is what's still in front of Judge Boasberg in D.C. is, did U.S. officials act in total contempt of his orders? Now, it's true that his orders have now been determined to be vacated, right, and that he didn't have jurisdiction, but it doesn't mean that people can get away with. You can't say, "Oh, well, we acted in contempt because you didn't have." The Supreme Court was going to overrule you later. Yeah,
you can't see the future and predict it and say, "Well, that's why we were in contempt." So Boasberg still can have adjudication of whether or not they acted in contempt of his order.
He could. It's a little bit of an uphill battle because it's in contempt of an order that has been vacated, and let alone
Right.
it's in contempt of an order that's being vacated on the basis that he shouldn't have had jurisdiction in the first place. But he
Yeah.
certainly could. And if they come back with habeas in DC and he thinks that that's proper, then I think he's in a much better position to proceed ahead with the contempt hearings.
Now, the dissent did reference a lot how the government was incredibly shady through the process of this.
Yes.
Did we get any sense if that factored into the majority, if that affected, how Roberts, for instance, looked at this or no?
It's a great question. There's, I think, no indication of how Roberts looked at that.
Okay.
I also think that might have been the reason why Justice Barrett did not join Sotomayor in that particular part of her dissent,
Okay.
because I think you could be in Justice Barrett's position and say, I'm not going to render a judgment on that yet. I don't want to prejudge that because that might be coming right back to us as a contempt issue.
Right.
And then we will have to look at the facts as to what exactly the government did to try to evade court jurisdiction.
That makes sense. Last question for you. There is a separate drama earlier today about this Maryland man who the government admits was wrongfully sent to El Salvador against a judicial decree that he should not be sent there. There was supposed to be a deadline of midnight for them to get him back to from El Salvador. Government has basically told various judges, pound sand, we don't have jurisdiction, can't get to him, he's in El Salvador. Earlier in the day, Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, issued a stay, essentially just giving more time for a resolution here. I don't think he was tipping his hand, but that's not covered in this, and that still is to be determined, correct?
100%, except the two are very much related to one another. And in fact, that's in some ways that you're bringing it up in the context of the other conversation, because the Maryland man is in El Salvador.
Right.
And the question is, can the U.S. government be compelled to bring him back?
Right.
That's the 200 plus. That's the 287 or whatever. That's the near 300 people. The answer that the Supreme Court gives to the Maryland man is going to significantly implicate the fate of those other people that are being taken to El Salvador.
And their ability to file a habeas petition. Yeah. Okay. That
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. So they just upped the ante, essentially.
Absolutely. And part of me thinks that Chief Justice Roberts often does give one to one side and one to the other. So in a way, he did what the Trump administration wanted in the Boasberg case.
Right.
Maybe he's going to come out the other way on the Maryland case.
And do we have sorry, I should know this, but what's the deadline he gave?
It's tomorrow. I think it's about 5 p.m. So it's just like an extra amount of time for a briefing. But the interesting thing is he said, I'm giving you that amount of time for the petitioners to get back to me. And then the petitioners, I think, filed within 30 minutes.
Yeah, they were ready.
Yeah, exactly. And the government's arguments in that case are particularly atrocious. I'll give one example of it.
Well, the Fourth Circuit really smacked him down, right?
Fourth Circuit smacked them down, including on the fact that the allegation that the man is MS-13,
right,
that the government presented no evidence of that to the district court. And that's the opportunity to present the evidence. You have it. And let alone the new Solicitor General of the United States, Sawyer, in his first brief to the U.S. Supreme Court, says that this person is a veritable MS-13 member, which is ridiculous, given what the Fourth Circuit said. That's not, they didn't argue that.
But Ryan, will it ultimately matter because the fundamental question is jurisdictional, right?
I know, I hear you, though. The government tries to make hay of this is an equitable situation. So when you're weighing the equities, you got to remember that we're trying to deal with MS-13 and this MS-13 member. And the answer is no, we don't, because you didn't even argue that.
Right. Well, we'll see. I'll have you back on at 5 p.m. tomorrow to discuss. All right, Ryan Goodman of Just Security. Thank you so much, bud. Really appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching. Really enjoy these conversations. I hope you do too. Subscribe to the feed, and we'll see you later.